The Center for Procurement Excellence is a nonprofit member organization with a mission of educating, promoting, and advocating for better RFP processes. Join CPE today and make your RFPs faster and more transparent. Membership also includes discounts to all of our training and networking events. CPE hosts a variety of virtual and in-person networking and training events throughout the year. Visit our website to get signed up. CPE Speakers Bureau is available for your regional and national meetings and professional conferences. Contact us to learn more.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
Welcome to the RFP Doctor session for July. We are going to talk about the unintended consequences of pre-qualification. We'll define what that means and walk through it together, which should be fun. What we're going to do in this one is, number one, I'll define what we mean by pre-qualification and share some examples and common places that this is used. Then we'll talk about some of the typical logic that goes behind these pre-qualification processes, also sometimes known as two-step procurements. Again, I'll define that here in just a moment. We'll chat about the unintended downsides of these processes and suggest maybe some better ideas, better approaches, summarize out from there. So number one, what do I mean by pre-qualification? Well, sometimes this is known as a two-step procurement process, where the first step is you pre-qualify teams, companies, firms, whatever have you, and then you invite those pre-qualified firms forward into a full RFP competition. So in other words, it's kind of like a pre-screening event before getting to the main course of the competition. And a couple things to point out with this is that these typically apply to a single project. So there is a definitive project scope where you can, wrap your arms around the scope boundaries and what's in versus what's out. There's a specific ask that the client organization has for a given project. Now, the reason why I mention that is you might be familiar with these other things called vendor of records or establishing a roster or an on-call standing order, vendor pool, a lot of different names, right? And usually these types of systems are, there's a pre-qualification step for vendors to get into your pool or onto your roster, and then you may issue separate task orders or separate projects to that pool. That is not what we are talking about today with pre-qualification. So we're not talking about a pool here or a roster or an on-call situation. You might also know those on-call situations by the acronym IDIQ, which means it's indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, because it's not tied to a specific individual project. You're pre-qualifying vendors in and then issuing multiple projects to that roster or to that list. So we're not talking about that. We did have a previous session on that topic way back in November of 2021. So you can go watch that video if you want to know about those on-call type of scenarios, but that is not what we are talking about today. So this is not it today. Today, what we're talking about is pre-qualifying who is allowed to compete for a single individual project, not a roster, but they're actually going to deliver that project if they are ultimately selected. So I hope that is clear. If there are questions on that, throw them into the chat. I'll try to illustrate it this way as well. There's really two flavors that these two-step procurements happen in. The first is shown here, try to show it graphically, which is you get many statements of qualifications being submitted. So all these qual statements could be submitted by potentially an unlimited number of teams who want to get pre-qualified for a given project. So you put out a request for qualifications, not a request for a quote, but a request for qualifications or a request for pre-qualification. You get qualifications-based responses in return. That information is reviewed, and then you'll typically shortlist down to maybe 3 or 5 top qualified or most qualified firms to then compete. And that could be in a full RFP proposal at that step. So might be a statement of qualification up front, and then you get full proposals on the back end. And these proposals might be what you would typically consider as normal for an RFP. There's written proposal elements, maybe an interview, maybe a presentation, plus cost is in there. So that's one way that a two-step procurement is often run. There is another way that's slightly different, but is worth mentioning too. The other way is that you might get proposals up front and then pre-qualify those to then lead to a bidding process with the pre-qualified. So that's another way that it can happen. They're slightly different, right? On the back end of this step too, it's pure low bid, whereas the back end of the original first one I showed here is more of a proposal scenario. So those are the two most common types of two steps. And so, Christy, I see you do both methods. That's good because I want to make sure folks are familiar with this, because it does pop up now and again, and there's pros and cons, and people have different opinions. That's what we're going to talk about today. Skip that. So, okay. Let me give you a few examples of where this stuff often gets used. Christy and others, I'd like to know in the chat, maybe throw in what type of projects these most commonly pop up for, because that's where I was going to go to as I see your comment there in construction. This is often capital projects oriented, but not only. So Jock, if Jock is job order contracting, again, I'm going to kind of put Jock more into that session here of your pre-qualifying for a roster. Job order contracting kind of fits into that more so than having a specific project. So kind of I'm trying to sidestep that one, but you're absolutely right. You usually would have a pre-qualification step there. But okay, so examples and common uses. So I'm going to go through what various industry groups and buyer groups have to say about this. But yes, it's most common in capital projects, often via alternative delivery. I see Chrissy put a construction manager at risk in there. You will sometimes see it for professional services, and especially in the architecture and engineering realm, even if that's separate from the full capital project construction side. That's where you'll often see it. There are other project types that will use a two-step. It's usually more of an occasional thing rather than a regular or normal thing. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But generally, the philosophy behind these two steps is widespread, even in other one-step processes. You'll see the two-step philosophy creeping into the mindset of project teams. So we're going to try to extract that a little bit today and break it down. So here's some examples. As Christy mentioned, for a construction manager at risk, one of the key professional groups out there is CMAA. These are quotes from some of their guides. This is their guide to capital projects and delivery methods to say, hey, in a one-step process, you get one round of submittals or proposals. All of us who are in RFP world are familiar with that. You issue the RFP, you get proposals back. But then there are the two-step processes, which is let's get some qualifications up front and then get a price proposal as the second step. So they're basically saying qualifications go first, and then it's a pseudo low bidding scenario, and according to the letter of the law here, rather than a proposal on that second step. First step, only submit qualifications, and then later we'll get more information, cost information. That's what they're saying. So that's one group's take. And there's some reasons why, right? We're trying to make sure that up contractor that we compete at the end is capable of performing the scope and so forth. So I'm going to skip some of that. Design Build Institute of America. So again, capital projects, they openly talk about the two-step. They use that terminology, two-step process. During step one, it's a request for qualifications. And then you shortlist those proposers down to maybe 3 is what they're recommending before you get to a more detailed proposal process. So that's their take on it. What you use for pre-qualification, well, it's qualifications of that team, their ability, their capacity to do work together, their experience in working together, maybe a project management plan, things like that, normal qualifications-based requirements. Unless you think that this is something that is, new to these professional groups, I pulled this old document from a cool time period in this country known as the 1990s. This came out in 1995. From both the American Institute of Architects and AGC. They talk about, two-phase selection processes and what the first phase should look like, right? So we recommend a two-phase procurement, get some submittals, shortlist and pre-qualify, then get down to 3 to 5 entities and compete from there on, their ability to do the work, their past performance, experience, and financial capacity, normal type of stuff. So that's their take. This is pulled from a state. So this is on a buyer side. This is a state procurement policy. I won't say who the state is. I guess you could find it, but this is just for pure A&E services, not even getting into alternative delivery. So, hey, professional services in the design space, first step, let's advertise a request for qualifications, evaluate those. And then second step, we'll find the top 3 to 5 highest scoring or best qualified firms and do more of a competition there. So those are some options. This is actually a recommendation from that same state of what you would evaluate in the first pre-qualification stage, which is stability of the companies who are interested, their experience, their suitability for the project, their past performance. Not all of these were clearly defined, but past performance really meant references. Experience might mean like years of experience, basic, simple qualifications-based things for the first phase of a pre-qual. So some of that, those of you who are familiar with the FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation, they have some processes for it as well. They talk about step one being more of a technical proposal to help refine a scope, and then the owner refines the scope and later gets pricing. So it's basically a first step to help refine scope and get proposals, get the most qualified, and then narrow down for a low bid, sealed priced bid scenario in the second step. So just showing you a bunch of options, canvassing the landscape, but they all boil down to this, right? It's qualifications up front and then get a proposal, or some type of qualifications and proposal up front and then go to low bid. That's the basic, most common flavors. So to summarize what we all just went through, pre-qualify, then proposal. A bunch of groups are advocating for that. Proposal, then pre-qualify that into price. There's some other groups that do that, but that's the basics. So hopefully I painted the picture of what a two-step is. I know it took a long time. So here's the logic behind breaking out a procurement process into those two distinct steps of larger pool and narrowing down a smaller pool just for a single individual project. So some logic, and this is not going to be a fancy slide. This is just coming bullet point at you. The basic logic is, let's get full proposals only from the most qualified firms. So let's kind of get rid of the unqualified from even having to submit their full proposal or getting into the final bidding stage and things like that. There is a perception that this saves time. There's a perception that it can streamline the evaluation team's focus. In other words, it's an efficient thing, right? I'm only going to, as an evaluation member, I'm only going to review proposals from a pre-qualified smaller pool of firms. That's kind of the idea there. There's also a strong notion that this reduces the workload for vendors. So, hey, as a vendor, I don't have to take the time to put together a detailed proposal for my client until I know that I've already been pre-qualified in. I'll just submit my standard qualification stuff up front, see if that makes the cut. If I'm the type of, style of vendor that client likes, I am in the eye of that beholder, and then I'll worry about working on the proposal then. There is some perception that it can increase competition, because you think about it from a vendor's point of view. If you get pre-qualified and now it's just you and two other competitors, you're just one of three. Well, now the odds are more in your favor than when you're competing against potentially 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 other bidders or proposers. So there is some thinking out there that says maybe the vendors will try harder if they think their odds are better to win. So there's some thought process there. This is just a slide from a federal training entity that I came across, right? Why they think it's beneficial. Expedite, you can still get the sealed bids on the back end if you want, can discuss with bidders if needed, and they think it speeds things up. I'm not necessarily saying that we at CPE agree with any of this. I'm just saying this is the general logic that folks will employ behind some of these two-step procurements. So let's talk about some downsides. I'm going to go back to the old 1990s documents. Since it's so old, no one will take offense if I pick at it a little bit, I hope. And want you to follow along with this. So here's some of the logic underlying the recommendation for a two-phase of pre-qualify and then do proposals later. So here's some of the quotes, right? Phase one, if you can pre-qualify in a two-phase or two-step process, you're going to take the number of competitors who submit the final proposals. You're going to limit those because you're going to pre-qualify them first. Hey, client, why this is good for you? If you don't limit the number, that means that you're going to have to spend an inordinate amount of time and public money comparing and evaluating proposals. So this is really for your benefit, client, to review less stuff. Okay. I want you to put your procurement hats on. What does this type of logic and line of argumentation make you think? You can go off of mute and shout it at me, or you can throw it in the chat. What's your initial reaction when you hear something like this as a procurement officer? Let's limit the number of competitors because it would be too much work to have to evaluate proposals. Is that really a good argument in the public procurement world? What if I came to you and I took this logic to its extreme and I said, I want to save taxpayer dollars by being efficient and not evaluating proposals, and I just want to sole source this contract. That is in the best interests of being efficient. right? That's what this is saying. This is saying in a nice way, right? Don't worry, client. This is for your benefits to help you be better focused, be more efficient. But it's really saying less competition. Let's narrow it down. Kind of interesting, I think. I admit, when I hear this statement, to me, it's not substantially different from a internal client group or business unit or agency coming to you and saying, we would like to sole source this contract because it would be faster that way. Yeah. And I see Heather, not usually the cheapest, right? So got to watch out for this stuff, right? So yeah, and I love this one too. By the way, if you let all the teams compete and then they don't get selected, then you have more vendors who are unhappy with you. Like, oh no, what if we had 10 vendors compete and we only get to pick one? That means there's 9 who are unhappy. Like, goodness, let's just not ruffle any feathers and sole source everything, I guess. I don't know. We don't have to worry about what those other vendors would think about in that case. Very interesting. So downsides here. I've already tipped my hand on some of these downsides, right? But it can reduce competition and potentially in an artificial manner. Why is it that you want to select down to 3 or maybe 5? Why even preset that number? Is that really in the best interest of the taxpayer? I'm not saying it has to be a low bid on the back end, but it is a reduction of competition. The other thing too, most of the examples I showed are focusing on past performance in the pre-qualification stage. What's the past performance, their references, their financial capacity? Have they worked together before? If it's a team up like a design build. I mean, if we can say this in the investing space, that past performance does not necessarily indicate future returns, I think the same thing applies here in procurement. And then the other big thing is that company level qualifications are not the same thing as the qualifications of the individual project team members. Oftentimes those upfront step 1, phase 1 pre-qualification steps focus on the company. Notice how I had suitability for the project and financial capacity in there. That's not specific to the individual project team members. That's the company as a whole. So if we're going to now start narrowing down the number of companies that can compete, what if one company had a really good project team who wanted to compete, but we just eliminated the company because they didn't have the same, big level metrics as some other companies? We are now artificially, again, reducing our competitive pool without truly factoring in the quality of the project team, which we know through prior research and teaching through CPE, the project team is what really moves the needle. And that's often not considered in that upfront pre-qualification. That's extremely dangerous to overlook the number one most important evaluation criteria upfronts and narrow the pool. Also, this is not actually faster. It's actually 2 rounds of procurement that have to be evaluated. So if you've ever been through one of these, it's pretty rare for it to be faster. So watch out for that. It does add paperwork, right? And the biggest thing, and Jeff, you can probably wax poetic on this better than I can, and just in having lived through it on the vendor side, a lot of times what happens is these 2 steps get abused, where we use the qualification side up front, and then it ends up just being a low bid on the back end. And it makes us want to say, stop trying to put lipstick on a pig. If you want to go low bid, just call it low bid. You don't have to have a fancy name to shield yourself as a 2-step procurement or 2-phase or any of that stuff. Just call it low bid with less competition, because that's really what it is. And it gets abused that way oftentimes, even if that's not the intent. Even if there was an intent to do qualifications up front and then a proposal later, a lot of times that price is weighted higher and it becomes de facto low bid. So the other big thing is it favors larger companies. Which companies like to submit big company-focused qualification statements up front? Big companies who have big marketing teams. That's who likes it. Why do a lot of these big professional groups advocate for these things? Because they're run by big companies, and this isn't a market advantage for them. It's just what we've seen throughout the years. So got to watch out for that too. If you're worried about your, targeted business group, participation, diverse suppliers, local vendors, and so forth, well, doing these 2 steps is definitely going to give advantage to the big firms on the block rather than some of those other targeted groups. And there's other downsides as well. It's a challenge. And yeah, initial interviews and all that. Remember, one of the big kicking and screaming points that you'll get from the vendor community is, hey, I cannot assign my team to you yet until I know I have the contract. You'll get that pushback to varying degrees across the different business sectors there are. But now if we put a whole extra step in between them getting the contract and when they have to identify their team, it just makes the kicking and screaming usually even greater. Or sometimes they just flat out are being less than truthful, we'll say nicely, like, oh yeah, Joe will be our project manager, but then it's like 2 or 3 months down the road before you'd even select them and then get a contract going. So watch out for that. Now, easy to pick at something. What's a better approach? I'm just going to give a few really short ideas because I'm running along here. Better approach might be this. One is, in general, our advice at CPE is to stick with a one-step RFP. Just kind of stick with that, but make sure it is streamlined, it's efficient, it's effective in itself. Definitely highly emphasize a focus on the key project team members here without separating it with a whole nother step into the mix. And do that with a structured interview approach with those project team members is a big deal. You're going to have price all included in a one-step RFP, of course. And yes, keep your 2-envelope system where price is separated out. Your evaluation team is not looking at price while they're evaluating qualifications. So that's still a good practice there. But basically, the better approach is just keep doing a good job with RFPs. That will better enhance competition that's open to all. We want to be open in terms of competition. And if you do a streamlined RFP that's focusing on the key criteria, it's also not that much work for the industry partners out there who want to come and compete. It is possible to have a well-balanced approach, is basically what we're saying here. And that's what we would recommend. There is always a caveat, though. So I'll give you a caveat. And this is not so much a CPE caveat. This is a something that the RFP doctors do in their simpler capacity when we're supporting folks. We do have 2-step procedures sometimes. And no, not every project needs an RFP. Come to our RFP class to go through the RFP versus low bid versus qualifications based. We have a whole segment of the class on how to make that decision. So not everything needs an RFP. But as I was saying here, when would we actually recommend doing a 2-step? It's in very select instances, and where we found it to be highly useful is in large and complex technology procurement. So this is different than capital projects and professional services. Large, complex technology procurements, we found this to be a cutting edge approach, I would say. I'll give you an example. So, and I've used this most commonly for large software projects. So the traditional approach to software projects is to do everything as one mega RFP. You issue one RFP out there, you're competing that software solution and doing demos of that product. At the same time, you're looking at your implementation partner or your deployment team or your system integrator all at once, which is really hard for an evaluation team to try to evaluate technological product at the same time as a consulting professional services based deployment team who's going to help you. It's a lot to do. And we'll usually consider both that implementation partner or integrator at the same time as the software solution. That's the traditional approach. We have found great success in breaking those apart. We found it to be a best practice, and again, a little bit beyond some of the CPE teachings, but to do 2 solicitations, pre-qualify your top softwares. I've got a note here. This is from an asset management project that I'm helping with. But first, focus on the products, find the products that best fits the team's needs, and then select the best implementation partner, and only implementation partners who can deploy the pre-selected or pre-qualified softwares are allowed to compete at that next step. And so that is a little different. You're kind of running 2 separate competitions rather than a pre-qual, but you kind of have to word the first one as a pre-qualification because you're usually going to pre-select or pre-qualify multiple softwares because you want to maximize competition on the back end with implementation partners. But you're not necessarily going to issue a contract to all of those softwares you pre-qualified. Only one will win in the end. So you call it a qualification. It's the best kind of procurement language approach we've found. But that in this scenario, we are huge fans of a 2-step. It's a very specific approach for a very specific type of project. If you want the more graphical view of that, right? Hey, upfront request for software qualifications. You check out all the different technologies, you demo them, you get the cost in there for them, you pre-qualify some amounts that you think can meet the needs of the client, and then you compete those implementation partners for the pre-qualified softwares and get the best overall combo in the end. So that's the way it would work there, where we think it works very well, but that probably is a departure from the traditional 2-step processes. So let's skip through. All right. So to summarize, Beware all the rhetoric that's out there from various highly interested parties that push for two-step processes. Hey, this is in your best interest. It's less work. It'll maximize competition, all that type of stuff. Watch out for the way people talk about this and stick to your solid procurement fundamentals. Are we maximizing competition with the process actually? Is it being fair and open to all? Is it truly streamlined and more efficient? Are we using the best evaluation criteria all the way through? If we screen out a vendor without even considering the quality of their team, that could potentially be problematic. I hope you agree. And basically the bottom line is a solid one-step RFP is usually the correct approach, especially once you go through the checkbox of your procurement fundamentals, which you all know. You all are experts in that. Don't let the rhetoric bamboozle you is the big takeaway.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.